Okay, and I think we're live. Yeah, today I just want to give a few brief thoughts on the courts, the judiciary, the which have become preeminent now that there's a possibility we might eventually have a conservative majority on the Supreme Court. Should Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Stephen Breyer, who's I think close to 80 or 80 years old, should they leave the court? And of course, speculation is rife now that Ruth Bader Ginsburg broke her hip. There was, or not her hip. I forget the actual injury she suffered, but she's hospitalized. And there was a great piece in, I believe it was the New Yorker, which scolded her for not retiring under Barack Obama, being so um narcissistic. Basically, they didn't spell it out in the piece, but this was by a liberal court watcher who was mad that she didn't resign and let herself be replaced by another liberal justice. And she didn't spell it out. She didn't say narcissistic, but I could tell that that was what she was aiming at. The fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has allowed her image to be mass marketed to basically become this commercial icon for feminists and left wingers across the country, with the RBG merchandise, the cookbook, the the feature film on HBO, and she's had to give her approval, her imprimatur, to all of these exercises. She could have exercised her right to sue these people for exploiting her image, but she hasn't, because she's kind of become obsessed with her own self-image as this bulwark against reaction and judicial originalism. And this piece basically scolded her for not being sensible enough to realize that she's becoming old. They even mentioned the fact that she's fallen asleep for 15, 20 minutes. There was one court session where she had to be she had to be woken up by Sonia Sotomayor because she was asleep. And people who actually watch her on the bench, this is one reason why cameras, if they allowed cameras into the Supreme Court, and honestly, I don't know how we're in the 21st century and they're still denying us access to watch them on the court. This seems like a fundamental infringement on our rights to watch our government operating. I mean, C-SPAN has been around since I think the 70s or 80s. Just we've been able to see every, or almost every major congressional hearing or debate on the Senate or the House floor, and yet we've been denied the same access to the Supreme Court, as if we're still living in the 19th century where video cameras did not exist. In any case, the piece I thought was a really very kind of well-reasoned argument that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is like all of these, or almost all of these Supreme Court justices, is just a very solipsistic, narcissistic person who loves her own image, and this image that she's created for herself as a liberal feminist icon. She just refuses to let it go, even if it means being replaced by 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 a Trump nominee who is the antithesis of everything she stands for. And I think the interesting speculation is on whether she will be able, she'll struggle on, like Thurgood Marshall, who was senile and unable to perform any of his duties, but clung like just uh, just clung to that Supreme Court seat until he eventually died and was replaced by Clarence Thomas. And I think that was the message of the piece, that this is what Ginsburg is about to do, and what she did when she didn't retire after Obama's reelection. And even another liberal, uh, liberal uh, judicial analyst, Randall Kennedy, professor of law, scolded her for the same reason in 2012, and Stephen Breyer as well. And I don't think people realize this, but also Stephen Breyer is close to 80. So technically, Trump, if things break the right way, he could end up appointing 2 more Supreme Court justices, which would match, I think, Richard Nixon's tenure in the White House, where he appointed Berger, Blackmun, Rehnquist, and Powell. It wasn't, as Pat Buchanan describes in his book about the White House years, it wasn't as impressive when you look at the actual decisions they ruled. The Nixon court technically was responsible for Roe versus Wade. And that's a decision that's on the chopping block. There have been a lot of liberals that have tried to make the comment, tried to imply that Roe versus Wade isn't on the table. But even if you assume that reversing Roe versus Wade isn't on the table, even if you assume that John Roberts has turned out to be one of George W. Bush's worst decisions, which is saying something when you consider that he was the architect of the Iraq War. Even if you think John Roberts is, and he has to a large extent turned into an Anthony Kennedy clone, maybe slightly more conservative, but still a bit of a weather vane. He's dependent upon approbation by liberal circles in Washington, D.C. But once Ruth Bader Ginsburg is replaced by Amy Coney Barrett or Amal Tharpar, or my preferences would be Diane Sykes, despite her age, or William Pryor to replace one or both of these justices. But Tharpar would be an interesting pick. The next pick after Kavanaugh, appointing someone who theoretically could gut Title IX. I mean, that would personally, I wouldn't have a problem with that pick either. But I think Amy Coney Barrett is going to be picked for political reasons, because even though she's a Catholic, she's a charismatic, which was brought up when her name was being mooted. So I think if Trump can't appoint an actual evangelical Christian, she would probably be the next closest thing, a charismatic Roman Catholic. So, and she has a very unimpeachable public profile. So I think she probably would be the next nominee, especially if it's to replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg. But again, I wouldn't have a problem with Tharpar, especially considering his great decisions on Title IX. But my preference, like I said, would be Diane Sykes or William Pryor. But anyway, we're going to see how this unfolds. Personally, I think the liberals, like I said, they're trying to give you the impression that Roe versus Wade is a sacrosanct part of law, and it's not. Even liberals realize how terrible that decision was, leaving aside the millions of unborn children who were prematurely, who faced premature death because of this horrible decision. Just in terms of the structure of the decision, it was a terrible decision with no underlying constitutional basis. And though they're trying to give you the impression that it's embedded and that it can't be reversed, as I said, one more justice and the Supreme Court has a conservative majority, and John Roberts, regardless of what he thinks, is irrelevant. And I don't think he will stand up to a 5-4. He's not going to be. He's not going to be a dissenter and on the losing side with the far left members of the court like Sotomayor. He wants to be in the majority and somehow shape the decision. So I think that's what's going to happen if we get another replacement, another pick, another Trump pick, hopefully sometime in the coming year or before the election. But we'll see.